Juan Carlos Hidalgo. I'm from Costa Rica. I'm a policy analyst. I work at the Cato Institute for 12 years. I'm done with Cato now. I'm going back to Costa Rica in the near future, in the next coming months. And I'm probably going to get involved in politics in Costa Rica. This is the pin. This is a poppy, which is the sign that people wear 2 weeks before Remembrance Day. Remembrance Day is November 11th. Is the anniversary of the end of World War One, and it's a poppy because the poppy is what grows in the fields of Flanders, where the trenches were in the First World War. So I I like it. I like it because I read a story about the Christmas truce. I don't know if you heard of the Christmas truce. The Christmas truce was in 1914 when the British and French troops fraternized with the German troops. They came out of the trenches and they exchanged gifts. They played football, and after the war, they got in touch with each other and kept writing letters. And I was fascinated with the story. I watched a movie, Joyeux Noël, is a French movie about that in 2008, I think. And in 2014, I decided to go with my wife to Flanders, to Ypres, which is the epicenter of the Western Front. And we were looking to celebrate the Christmas truce, the 100th anniversary of the Christmas truce. And interestingly enough, there were a lot of people like us from all over the world who came spontaneously to that spot. So we spent the most amazing Christmas. And since then, I've been wearing the poppy every time there is a Remembrance Day is coming. Well, we can safely say, and this is something that Transparent International said, that Brazil was the epicenter of corruption in Latin America, at least in this decade. It was exporting corruption to all over the region. There was a very elaborate scheme around Odebrecht, but not only Odebrecht, OAS was also a construction company. And we saw that the impact of these corruption cases have had profound effects in Peru, in Ecuador, in Dominican Republic, in Panama, and so on. One thing that is interesting about this is that we can actually use these corruption scandals as a way to measure how strong is the rule of law in certain countries. We know for a fact how much money was paid in bribes in Panama, for example, in Dominican Republic, which are small economies, but they were among the leading countries where bribes were paid. We also know about Mexico and so on. But then we know for a fact that in some of these countries, nothing happened. In Mexico, not much has been uncovered regarding Odebrecht's deals. The same in Panama, the same in the Dominican Republic. Whereas in other countries, particularly in Brazil, of course, which was where everything originated, but also in Peru, we have seen that the Attorney General office has been doing its job, the courts have been doing their job, presidents have been arrested, powerful politicians have been put under arrest. So it has been a good way to measure then how strong are institutions in the fight against corruption. And we have seen a great disparity along the region. In the case of Brazil, of course, it's interesting to see that it came out of nowhere. I mean, it's not a big surprise that corruption was pervasive, but it came out of nowhere, the extent of corruption, implicating basically all political parties, leading figures from the government, back then from the Workers' Party and the opposition. And the fact that piecemeal reforms that were implemented throughout the years, it wasn't just a big reform that we can pinpoint. It was piecemeal reforms that were implemented during the 1990s, during the 2000s, earlier this decade, that led to the strengthening of the federal police, the judiciary, the attorney's office, and that created the conditions for these corruption cases to be prosecuted successfully here in Brazil. So, yes, in one sense, Brazil was the problem, but on the other one, it has given us a clue of what kind of reforms can be implemented in other countries in Latin America in order to fight corruption, particularly when it comes to plea bargaining, which is perhaps the most effective tool we have seen in Brazil when it comes to uncovering and bringing to justice all these corruption cases. We need to be careful also, because in the fight against corruption, bad things can happen too. Excesses can happen, and we have seen that in Peru particularly. The abuse that the authorities, the judiciary authorities, have done of arrests, preventive arrest, uh, which is, preventive arrest should be an exception to the rule in very particular circumstances. If the suspect, because it's not a criminal yet, if the suspect is thought to be dangerous, violent, if there is a chance that he might interfere with the investigation, or in the chance that he might escape. But we have seen that jailing preemptively people in Peru has been the norm. And in some cases, like Pedro Pablo Kuczynski, the former president, he was jailed for 3 years without a trial. And that's not the way that justice is supposed to work. So we have to be also careful that maybe, yes, there is a lot of enthusiasm to fight corruption, but in the lead to fight corruption, abuses can happen. But indeed, we not only have to see how to fight corruption, and we have identified what is the biggest source of corruption in Latin America nowadays, which is public procurement, public contracts, particularly regarding infrastructure. Yes, it's an area where, unfortunately, we're facing a big challenge. If the government builds infrastructure by its own, sometimes there's going to be corruption too. There's going to be a lot of waste. And many times the governments don't have money to build all these infrastructure projects. And that's why we have developed the public-private partnerships, and we have developed all these figures where the private sector is involved in building infrastructure, whereas it's like refineries or metros, systems, and so on. But now what we have found is that that's a major source of corruption. Of course, that companies pay bribes in order to get these contracts. Several years ago, before the Odebrecht scandal broke out, I was having lunch with a friend who was an ambassador to the OAS from one country that was particularly hit. I'm not going to say which one, but it was particularly hit with the Odebrecht scandal. And he told me something that I haven't thought about it. And he said, haven't you noticed that American firms never win contracts for infrastructure in Latin America? And I was like, well, that's right. That's interesting. And why is it so? Well, because the U.S. have the most strict rules regarding punishing companies that pay bribes in order to get contracts. I mean, the Department of Treasury will banish companies if they are found to pay bribes in other countries. So that's why American firms don't engage in that kind of corruption, and that's why they never win contracts. That's a good way to figure out if the system is corrupt. If American firms are out, that probably means that they are, because they're not paying bribes. That happened. That he told me this several years before the Odebrecht scandal broke out in Latin America. Eventually, his words were pretty prophetic. But indeed, so we have to figure out what instruments, what kind of balances can be implemented within the legislation, so we can, yes, keep having public-private partnerships in order to build infrastructure. It's the best way to build infrastructure out there, but without the corruption. In this regard, we will have to look at the best practices around the world. We don't have to invent hot water in that regard. We have noticed that Chile, for example, is a country where we haven't seen corruption scandals regarding the building of infrastructure, and there is a lot of participation of the private sector in building infrastructure in Chile. So maybe we have to see what is Chile doing in that regard, regarding building infrastructure. And of course, that's how to prevent corruption, and the other one is how to fight corruption, which means implementing these legal reforms that have been proved very effective in bringing these cases out to the open and fighting justice. Some of them are legal reforms to the judiciary, to the way that these cases can be investigated, like pre-bargain. Other ones have to do with institutions, which, according to research, the research I've looked at, the free press, having an independent and widely read free press, is one of the key factors in fighting corruption in societies. I have to confess that I think that my professional capabilities to discuss Chile are quite diminished, because I think that the problem with Chile is not about public policy, it's about psychology. And I'm not a psychiatrist. Probably that's what will be best to discuss what's going on in that country. Look, if you look at every single indicator in Latin America, Chile is always among is either the leading country or is among the top 2 or 3 countries in the region. Whereas we are talking about the economy, whether we're talking about social welfare, where we're talking about democratic institutions, where we're talking about transparency and corruption. I mean, every single indicator, Chile is always leading the pack, which makes these protests, these riots, profoundly disturbing. Why is it that a society that is so successful by every single objective metric is so unhappy? Well, I have several theories. I've been to Chile many times. I began going to Chile in 2010, and I remember that I remember witnessing how there is a large sector of society that, even though is doing well, they feel that the system is illegitimate because it was implemented. The economic model is illegitimate because it was implemented by dictatorship, by the dictatorship of Pinochet. Even though, the economic system was implemented by Pinochet, but then it was deepened by the democratic governments that came afterwards, left-wing governments by the Concertación. So if you look at young people in Chile in particular, that line of thought is very pervasive. People believe that the system is not illegitimate. If you look at the footage from the protests and the riots in Brazil and the march and all that stuff, you see that it's mostly young people who don't know how Chile was before this model was implemented. Let's go back to 1973 when Allende was toppled by Pinochet. And even 2 years later, when Pinochet was still trying to figure out what to do with the economy, Chile had 50% poverty rate. Chile had 500% inflation. Chile had shortages of food. You have to make a line to get chicken and all that. I don't know if you know Carlos Sabino, this sociologist professor from University Francisco Marroquín. He is from Argentina originally. He spent some time in Chile, then he immigrated to Venezuela. So he's been following the populist path. But he was a communist. He was a socialist. And one day I asked him, so what made you change your mind? And he said, well, I was doing the line to buy chicken in Chile. And I figured out, well, this is not working. Socialism is definitely not working. And that's how he changed it. He didn't read Mises. He didn't read Hayek. He just by making the line to buy chicken. So Chile was a mess. And even up to the 1990s, when Pinochet left power, poverty was still over 40% of the population. But the people in the streets right now rioting against the system, against the model, don't remember those days. They are the sons of prosperity. And now they feel that they can be better off. But how? Exactly. Well, they're demanding free education. They're demanding free healthcare. They're demanding all free goodies that we know that there's no such a thing as a free lunch. I mean, somebody has to pay for it. So in their sense, Chile can be a fairer society if government will give more stuff for free. And we know how things work out when they go that way. Of course, we have that nirvana that many people in Latin America look up to, which is the Scandinavian societies. They say, well, in Scandinavia, that works. You have successful societies with big welfare states that are generous, and we could replicate that in Latin America. But every time that has been tried in Latin America, we end up with corruption, we end up with low economic growth, we end up with higher unemployment, and we end up with higher poverty. And I'm afraid that that's going to be the case in Chile. There is also one more point about Chile that I want to mention, and I need to write this down. But Chile is a democracy, one of the strongest democracies in Latin America, along with Uruguay and Costa Rica. They just had an election 2 years ago where the choices were pretty stark. On the one hand, they had a candidate, Alejandro Guiller, who promised more welfare, more redistribution, higher taxes on the rich, free higher education, and so on. On the other one, they had another candidate who promised to focus on the model, on the economic model, focus on investment, job creation, economic growth, and so on. The candidate who promised job creation, investment, and so on won overwhelmingly. So why, if there is such a large discontent in Chilean society, why didn't manifest it in the polls? Why didn't they go to vote for the candidate who was promising that nirvana of redistribution and welfare state? Well, that's something that I think we have to incorporate in our analysis of Chile. We cannot allow these demands to be enforced on a society by riots, protests, and even march. There is a way that you can channel your discontent. Go to vote. Particularly if there is a candidate that is promising what you are asking for. So that's one of the things that really concern me about Chile. That we are going to normalize some behavior that is anathema to democracy. The other day I was doing an interview and we were discussing Uruguay. That Uruguay is also in an electoral process. And it's one of the most stable countries in the region. You don't see riots in Uruguay. You don't see protests in Uruguay. Somebody asked me, well, why is it? And I think, you know what? I think it has to do with the fact that they have left-wing governments for the last 15 years. And it's not because the left-wing government has been successful or particularly good. It's just that when the left is in power, you don't see riots. You don't see people burning buses or businesses, Let's wait now that there is a big chance that the right is coming back to power in Uruguay. And I wouldn't be surprised that within a year or two, we will see riots in Uruguay and all that, because that's how the left, unfortunately, channel their demands. It's not through the democratic means, but through the democracy of the street, and we should not allow that. It's interesting how these protests were triggered. They were triggered by a rise of 4 cents of a dollar on the metro system, on the metro fares. The most modern metro system in Latin America. And that led in 24 hours to 80 metro stations being destroyed in Chile. Like 20 of them burned down. I saw the images of the metro trains in flames. And the first thought I had was, I wish we had a metro system like that in Costa Rica, So how do you explain that this spontaneous act of anger led to the systematic destruction of 80 metro stations in Santiago? I mean, there is something out there that needs to be explained. The other day, I was in bed. I was about to go to bed. It was 11 p.m. And this friend from mine, he lives in Punta Arenas, and he's the editor of El Pingüino, which is the newspaper of that region, Magallanes. And he sent me a WhatsApp. In the WhatsApp, you could hear windows being destroyed by rocks, and you can see like rocks being thrown and things smashing and all that stuff. He said, we are under attack. There is a mob outside throwing rocks and throwing Molotov cocktails into the building where the newspaper is. I mean, how come like outrage about inequality can lead to mobs attacking newspapers? That doesn't make sense. So there is something out there that needs to be explained. The problem is that the left is very skillful in setting the terms of the debate. Whenever you mention this, they say, oh, you're paranoid. You're paranoid. You see Chavistas all over the place, And so they make you look like a paranoid. They make you look like a freak, even though you're asking pertinent questions, I think. Yeah, I think that there is a lesson when it comes to Chile, and is that we thought that the successes of an economic model will be the first line of defense of that model or of that idea. If you have a model, an economic model that is reducing poverty, if you have a model that is reducing inequality, if you have a model that is providing social mobility, and all the other possible indicators, you will think that you don't need to be defending that model constantly at a grassroots level or in the universities or in the media and so on. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem to be that way. It seems that if you don't pay attention to what the other side is doing and the ideas they're spreading, uh, that model can be under attack. So that's a lesson I think that we need to incorporate here in Brazil and everywhere. Accomplishing the reforms that we believe in is already very hard. But then, even after we accomplish them, we cannot sleep in our laurels. We have to keep defending these ideas because otherwise, perceptions can be created, that the system is not working for the regular guy, which is not the case, but eventually that can lead to problems. Yeah, I read an article. I don't remember who was the author saying that Chile was the first revolution of the modern era. Uh, we'll have to see. Again, we see very different particularities in each case. In the case of the uh, yellow jackets in France, uh, there were some similar grievances. Like people in the rural areas felt neglected by Paris, and the rise of fuel prices, a tax on diesel in particular, was the trigger that led to these protests. We saw how Macron handled those. Uh, then we have seen the Arab Spring, which has to do more like with having dictatorships in place and people, young people particularly, being hopeless regarding the economy, unemployment, and also like having a voice in electing their leaders. We saw how that ended up, and we have the most successful example, which is Tunisia, but then we have disasters like Libya. Uh, in the case of Latin America, we're seeing different protests. Uh, we saw what happened in Ecuador, also something that needs to be looked at. In that case, the trigger was more abrupt, which was the ending of fuel subsidies, and that tends to be very toxic when it comes to its politics. That's like a third rail of politics around the world. You touch the price of oil or of fuel, and then boom, you have riots. That's something that needs to be looked at. Uh, you know, I've been reading about Emmanuel Macron in France, and I found something very interesting because France is very Latin American in some regards. It's a country where you have an ostracized political class, and people who don't believe in politics. The economy was doing pretty bad. Growth was low, unemployment was high, taxes high, and the need for reform was very obvious. However, government after government, electoral cycle after electoral cycle, politicians in France will avoid discussing the need for reforms to the public. But once they are in power, they will try to introduce reforms. And we saw that with Chirac, we saw that with Sarkozy, we saw that with Hollande. And the reaction will be strikes and people going into the streets and protests, and then they will have to backtrack and then rise and they will try to do it again. Macron said, like, no, if we want to break that cycle, we need to talk to the people honestly, like during the election, and tell them that the country needs to be reformed and what kind of reforms need to be done. And if that politician wins, and I think you can win with that discourse, then you have a mandate to pursue these reforms. And this is what he did. He came to the French people with a new party, and he said, we need to reform the pension system. we need to reform employment laws, we need to cut taxes, we need to cut the payroll, the public payroll. Reforms that, even though he's not a libertarian, we will, as libertarians, identify with that agenda. And he won the election decisively, and he has been implementing those reforms. Yeah, he had some hiccups, and it's interesting that in the case of the major hiccup he had was with the yellow vest protest, but it had to do with raising a tax, actually, not lowering taxes. But in the case of going back to Ecuador, I'm not digressing. I'm going back to why I mentioned this. In the case of Ecuador, you have a president that came to power promising that he was the heir of Rafael Correa, that he was going to continue Rafael Correa's populist policies. But then he found that the country was bankrupt, and he tried to do a U-turn, and this is what happened. People went up to the streets because that's not what they voted for. So we have to keep those things in mind when we analyze protests in Latin America, because even though we believe that the policy might be right, in this case, yeah, removing those subsidies was extremely right. However, the politics is wrong, because this is not what you promise your voters you will do. And voters are right to be angry. This is not the case of Chile, again, going back to the example of Chile. Piñera was doing what he promised to do, and he was voted. And then you have other examples like Bolivia. In Bolivia, people are in the streets not because of economic policy. Actually, Bolivia is one of the countries that have been doing the best in terms of economic growth. They're in the streets defending their democracy from electoral fraud. So you will have to look at the different cases one by one. I don't think that we can talk that there is a single rule that is determining all these protests, going from Hong Kong to Lebanon and, the Arab Spring and France and Latin America. Well, it's interesting because in the case of Brazil, the people who went up to the street, they were demanding more transparency, less corruption, better public services. And I think that was a fair demand, given the circumstances. And also, it's not that there was an electoral option particular that was enticing for these people. They felt like the whole political class was corrupt. So I look at that differently from the case again of Chile. In the case of Chile, we see a middle class that is demanding free stuff. And I think that there is a trap in there. Is people who are demanding higher pensions without having to work for those, or free access to college, or free access to all sorts of healthcare and so on. So I think there is a difference between both cases. In one case, I identify with the demands of the Brazilian middle class. It's not that they want the government to provide more stuff. They just want, they're already paying a lot for it. And that's the difference. That's a lesson that Chileans should look at Brazil. If they had higher taxes and higher levels of spending, it's not that they're going to end up like Finland. It's probably they're going to end up like Brazil. In that case, I think that the Brazilian middle class, their demands can be channeled in a positive way. And that's where probably we have the greatest opportunity, giving them a narrative of how things can improve if we reform the Brazilian government, the Brazilian state. Well, the evidence says that economic growth is the best tool. There was that paper by the World Bank in 2013 that looked at all over the world, 118 countries, and they look at the bottom 40% of the population, the poorest 40%, and they looked at the increase in welfare, in incomes during this period of 40 years. 77% had to do with economic growth, and only 23% had to do with redistributionist programs, social programs. Many people are under the idea that poverty came down in Latin America in the last decade and a half because you have more generous programs like Bolsa Familia and so on, and that had a great social impact. But that's not the case. Actually, even research made during this period shows that economic growth was the key component. And now that economic growth has stalled, we see that those victories, those gains regarding poverty are being reversed, even though the programs continue to be generous to the poor. So we need economic growth. This paper from the World Bank also found that there is a one-on-one relationship between economic growth and the income of the poorest 40% of the population. That means that if you live in a country that is growing 2%, the poorest 40% have their incomes grow by 2%. If you live in a country that grows 5%, the poorest 40% see their incomes grow by 5%. So the faster an economy grows, the better for the poor. And I think that the trap that we have fall into in Latin America is believing that social programs by themselves are the best way to tackle poverty. They can be of help. I'm not dismissing the need for social programs. I believe in a safety net, but that's a temporary solution. That's not going to be the ultimate solution to the problem, which is lifting these people out of poverty. And I think that most governments want to see the number of people in poverty reduced, but there are some others that don't. And remember what one official from the Venezuelan regime once said, that like the problem is that if people leave poverty in Venezuela, they're going to become members of the opposition, he said. So there are people out there who like poverty because it provides a big market for their political aims. Well, let me mention one that is not only absurd but profoundly dangerous, and this is the case of Costa Rica. In the case of Costa Rica, if we have Social Security, we have the Social Security institution, which is pensions and healthcare, and each worker pays a contribution, which is 9% of his salary to for pensions and healthcare. However, if you're an independent worker in Costa Rica, that institution charges you double that. They charge you 18% for pensions and healthcare. But not only that, let's say that I go back to Costa Rica. I'm almost 40. And I go there and I want to register. Even I want voluntarily to have the Social Security take almost a fifth of my income, even though I don't use the healthcare system, because when I'm sick, I'm probably going to go to a private doctor, and the pension system is going to be bankrupt in 15 years. But let's say I go voluntarily to join. The Social Security institution in Costa Rica, la Caja Costarricense de Seguro Social, they look at your profile and they say, well, you are 40. What have you been doing all these years, So we're going to estimate how much payments you missed since 2006, and we're going to charge you for all those payments that you haven't done since 2006, because that's the year where they started this, and we're going to charge you interest on top of that. We're going to charge you a penalty. So even if I voluntarily want to join Social Security, contribute a fifth of my income to the system, the government tells me, well, not so fast. You still have to pay millions of colones, thousands of dollars in penalties for all the contributions that you didn't make through all the years. So guess what? 92% of independent workers in Costa Rica are informal. They just don't join Social Security. I think that's one of the stupidest things you can ever think. If I were president of the Social Security institution, I would say, like, not only let's lower the contribution to 9%, like every other worker in the private sector, but let's not charge a penalty for back contributions, because that actually is preventing people from joining the system.